The reunion of Maria and David Sanchez was supposed to be a testament to the enduring power of love, a quiet, hard-won victory after a decade of loss and separation. For 10 years, Maria had waited, a solitary lighthouse on a storm-tossed shore, keeping the flame of their marriage alive while her husband, David, served a sentence for a crime she believed he didn't commit. But the man who walked out of the prison gates was not the same man who had walked in. The reunion, so desperately longed for, lasted only 4 days. It ended not with a joyful celebration of freedom, but with a horrified, whispered discovery in the dead of night, a discovery that would not just end their marriage, but would unravel a story of hidden depravity and unspeakable violence far darker than the crime for which David had been imprisoned. Maria Sanchez was a woman forged in resilience. At 42, her face was a roadmap of her life, the fine lines around her eyes, a testament to both laughter and long years of quiet weeping. She was a nurse at a community clinic in a dusty, working-class suburb of Phoenix, a job that suited her compassionate, no-nonsense nature. Her life for the past decade had been a study in suspended animation. She lived in the same small, tidy house she and David had bought as newlyweds. She kept his clothes in the closet, his tools in the garage, his photograph on her nightstand. She had put her own life on hold, her existence a long, patient vigil. For his return, David had been her entire world. They were high school sweethearts, a classic story of the quiet, steady football player and the bright, fiery cheerleader. Their love was the stuff of local legend, a deep, unshakable bond that everyone assumed was unbreakable. They married, young, had a son, and built a simple, happy life. David was a mechanic, a man with calloused, capable hands who could fix anything. He was her rock, her protector, her best friend. And then, it had all been shattered. A bar fight that had gone horribly wrong. A man had died. David, who had been there with friends, swore he had only been trying to break it up. But a witness, a man with a grudge against him, had pointed the finger. The evidence was circumstantial, the public defender overworked, and David, with his quiet, stoic demeanor, had been an easy conviction. Manslaughter, 10 years. Maria never believed it. Not for a second. The David she knew, the gentle giant who would rescue stray cats and cry at sad movies, was not a killer. He was a victim of a flawed system, a man in the wrong place at the wrong time. And so, she waited. She wrote to him every day. She visited him every month, making the long, lonely drive to the state penitentiary. She raised their son, Leo, on her own, filling his head with stories of his father's goodness, of his strength, of the injustice that had been done to him. The day of his release was the day her life was supposed to begin, again. She stood outside the prison gates, her heart pounding with a nervous, giddy excitement she hadn't felt in a decade. The sun was a harsh, white glare in the Arizona sky, and then the heavy steel door opened, and he walked out. He was thinner, his face harder, his dark hair now shot through with grey. The 10 years had carved new lines into his face, lines of hardship and a deep, weary sadness. But his eyes, when they met hers, were the same. They were the eyes of the boy she had fallen in love with. She ran to him, and he wrapped her in his arms. The hug was fierce, desperate, a silent acknowledgement of all the lost years. He smelled of institutional soap and something else, something she couldn't quite place, the faint, metallic scent of confinement. "You're home," she whispered into his chest, tears streaming down her face. "I'm home," he said, his voice rough, unused to expressing emotion. The drive back to Phoenix was quiet, but it was a comfortable silence. They held hands, their fingers intertwined, a physical reconnection after a decade of separation through plexiglass and telephone receivers. When they pulled into the driveway of their small house, the house he hadn't seen in 10 years, he just stared at it, his face a mask of unreadable emotion. "It's the same," he said, his voice a low whisper. "I kept it for you," she replied softly. "For us." Their son, Leo, now a lanky, quiet 17-year-old, was waiting inside. The reunion between father and son was awkward, freighted with the weight of a decade of missed birthdays, missed first days of school, missed everything. Leo, who only knew his father through his mother's stories and the stilted, supervised visits of the prison, didn't know what to say. David, a man who had been stripped of his fatherhood, didn't know how to be a father anymore. They shook hands, a formal, heartbreaking gesture between two strangers who should have been the closest of kin. The first day was a blur of quiet adjustments. David walked through the house like a ghost, touching familiar objects, a photograph, a piece of furniture, a chipped coffee mug, as if trying to reconnect with a life he had only dreamed of for 10 years. He was overwhelmed by the simple things, the softness of the sofa, the taste of Maria's home-cooked food, the freedom to open a grating window and feel the breeze on his face. Maria watched him with a heart full of a fierce, protective love. She knew this would be hard. She had read all the books, attended all the support groups for families of the incarcerated. She knew that reintegration was a long, difficult process. He was institutionalized, his rhythms and responses shaped by a decade of survival in a brutal, unforgiving environment. She had to be patient. She had to be his anchor. That night, as they prepared for bed, a new kind of tension filled the air. It was the tension of a wedding night. The nervous, hopeful anticipation of two people about to rediscover a physical intimacy that had been denied them for so long. Maria's hands trembled as she changed into a new nightgown she had bought for the occasion. She was 42, her body no longer the firm, youthful body of the woman he had left behind. She was nervous, insecure. David came out of the bathroom, his body still thin, but the hard, lean muscle of prison labor visible beneath his skin. He looked at her, and for the first time since his release, she saw a flicker of the old David, the husband, the lover. He came to her and kissed her, a deep, hungry kiss that spoke of a decade of longing. He led her to the bed, their bed, and they made love. It was not the gentle, familiar lovemaking she remembered. It was rough, urgent, almost desperate. It was the act of a man reclaiming his life, his wife, his manhood. Maria, caught up in the raw emotion of the moment, met his urgency with her own. This was it. They were whole again. Afterwards, as they lay tangled in the sheets, he held her, his body pressed against hers. "I missed you so much," he whispered into her hair, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "I'm here," she said, her heart overflowing. "I'm not going anywhere." The second day was better. David seemed more relaxed, more present. He spent the morning in the garage, surrounded by his old tools, a look of quiet contentment on his face. He fixed a leaky faucet that Maria had been meaning to call a plumber for. He was reclaiming his role as the man of the house, the fixer, the provider. In the afternoon, Maria had to work a shift at the clinic. She was hesitant to leave him alone, but he insisted. "I'll be fine," he said, smiling his old, gentle smile. "I'm not going anywhere. I've got 10 years of daytime television to catch up on." When she came home that evening, she found him in the kitchen, attempting to cook dinner. He had made a mess, but he was trying. He had made her favorite: spaghetti with meatballs. The first meal he had ever cooked for her when they were teenagers. The gesture was so sweet, so thoughtful, that it brought tears to her eyes. They ate dinner with Leo, and for the first time, it felt like a family. David asked Leo about school, about his plans for the future. He was trying, awkwardly but sincerely, to bridge the gap of the lost years. That night, they made love again. It was gentler this time, slower, more like the intimacy she remembered. But as they lay in the dark afterwards, Maria noticed something: a new tattoo on his lower back, just above his hip. It was a small, crudely drawn symbol, a stylized spider in the center of a web. "When did you get this?" she asked, tracing the outline with her finger. His body tensed at her touch. "In prison," he said, his voice flat. "You get tattoos in prison. It's what you do." "What does it mean?" she asked. "Nothing," he said, curtly, rolling away from her. "It doesn't mean anything." The sudden coldness in his tone was a small, jarring note in the symphony of their reunion, but Maria dismissed it. It was a part of his prison life, a part of the trauma he had endured. It was a world she couldn't understand, a door he was not yet ready to open. She would not push. The third day, The cracks began to show. David was restless, agitated. He paced the small house like a caged animal. The quiet, suburban world he had dreamed of for a decade was now a prison of a different kind. It was too quiet, too slow. He was used to the noise, the structure, the constant, low-grade threat of the penitentiary. Freedom was a vast, terrifying expanse, and he didn't know how to navigate it. He grew irritable, snapping at Maria for small things, like the way she loaded the dishwasher or the channel she was watching on TV. He got into a tense, angry argument with Leo about his son's long hair. "You look like a girl," he had sneered, his voice laced with a contempt that was shocking to Maria. "In my world, a man who looks like that gets eaten alive." "This isn't your world anymore, Dad," Leo had shot back, his own voice trembling with a mixture of fear and defiance. "This is our world, and you don't know anything about it." Leo had stormed out of the house, and David had punched the wall, leaving a spiderweb of cracks in the drywall. He had immediately apologized, his face a mask of shame and regret. "I'm sorry," he had said to Maria, his voice shaking. "I don't know what's wrong with me. It's hard. Being out, being normal." Maria had held him, comforted him, told him it was okay, that it would just take time. But a cold seed of fear had been planted in her heart. The man who had punched the wall was not the gentle David she remembered. He was a stranger, a man whose anger was a coiled, dangerous thing just beneath the surface. That night, there was no lovemaking. They lay in bed, a tense, silent chasm between them. David fell into a restless, troubled sleep, his body twitching, muttering things in his sleep that she couldn't understand. Maria lay awake, her mind racing. She thought about the tattoo, the sudden flashes of rage, the way he had looked at their son. 10 years was a long time. A prison was a brutal, dehumanizing place. It changed a man. She had been so focused on the injustice of his conviction that she had never truly considered the reality of what a decade in that world would do to him. She had been waiting for a ghost, the memory of the man he had been. The man lying next to her was a stranger, a man forged in a crucible of violence and survival she could not even begin to imagine. On the 4th day, the day that would change everything, David was a different person again. He was apologetic, attentive, the gentle husband once more. He made her breakfast in bed. He apologized to Leo, his voice full of a sincere, heartfelt remorse. He suggested they spend the day together, as a family, maybe go for a hike. Maria, desperate to believe that everything would be okay, agreed. They drove to a nearby state park, the mood in the car cautiously optimistic, but the hike was a disaster. David was on edge, constantly, looking over his shoulder, his body tense with a hyper-vigilance that was completely out of place in the peaceful, sun-dappled woods. A group of loud, boisterous teenagers on the trail set him off. "They're looking at you," he hissed to Maria, his hand instinctively going to her arm, his grip tight. "They're just kids, David," she said, trying to calm him. "They're not looking at anyone." But he couldn't relax. The freedom of the open space seemed to agitate him more than the confinement of the house. They cut the hike short and returned home in a tense, heavy silence. That evening, Maria knew they had to talk. The cycle of tension, explosion, and apology was not sustainable. Their dream of a happy reunion was already turning into a nightmare. After Leo had gone to his room, she sat down with David in the living room. "We need to talk," she said, her voice gentle, but firm. "David, I know this is hard, but the anger, the paranoia, it's scaring me. It's scaring Leo. You need help. A therapist. Someone to talk to about what you went through in there." He looked at her, his face a closed, guarded mask. "I don't need a shrink," he said, his voice low and cold. "I just need to adjust. I'm fine." "You're not fine," she insisted. "You punched a hole in the wall. You're afraid of teenagers on a hiking trail. You're not the man I remember." "The man you remember is gone," he snapped, his voice rising. "He died in that shithole. You want him back. He's not coming back. You're stuck with me." "I don't want him back," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "I want you, the real you, but I don't even know who that is anymore. and I can't live like this, walking on eggshells, waiting for the next explosion. The argument escalated, their voices rising, a decade of frustration, fear, and unspoken resentment pouring out. It was the first real fight of their reunion, and it was brutal. It ended with David storming out of the house, slamming the door behind him. He was gone for hours. Maria sat in the silent house, her heart aching. This was not how it was supposed to be. She had waited 10 years for this, and it was all falling apart in a matter of days. He came back just after midnight, drunk. He stumbled into the house, his eyes bloodshot, his movements clumsy. He reeked of cheap whiskey. "Where were you?" she asked, her voice a mixture of anger and worry. "Out," he slurred. "Getting some air. Getting away from you and your nagging." He stumbled towards the bedroom. "Come on," he said, a sloppy, leering grin on his face. "Let's go to bed. Let's make up." "No, David," she said, standing her ground. "Not like this. You're drunk." "I'm your husband," he said, his voice turning ugly. He grabbed her arm, his grip much harder this time. "You do what I say." He dragged her into the bedroom and threw her onto the bed. He was not the gentle, desperate lover of the first night. He was a brute, his movements rough and angry. It was not love-making. It was an assault, an act of dominance and rage. Maria lay there, tears streaming down her face, her body a passive, violated object. This was not her husband. This was a monster. When he was finished, he rolled off her and passed out almost. Immediately, his body collapsing into a drunken, snoring heap. Maria lay in the dark, her body bruised, her spirit shattered. The last flickering ember of hope she had been clinging to was extinguished. The man she had waited for was well and truly gone, replaced by this violent, angry stranger. Her marriage was over. Her dream was dead. She got up, her movements slow and stiff. She went into the bathroom to clean herself up. As she was washing her face, she looked at David's clothes, which he had thrown in a heap on the floor. His wallet had fallen out of his jeans pocket. On a sudden, inexplicable impulse, she picked it up. She didn't know what she was looking for. A clue, perhaps. An answer to the question of who this man had become. She opened it. Inside was his driver's license, a few dollars, and a folded, worn piece of paper. She unfolded it. It was a small, photocopied flyer, the kind that gets passed around in prisons. It was an advertisement for a prison tattoo artist. The flyer was covered in crude, hand-drawn images of various gang symbols and prison tattoos. Her eyes scanned the page, and then she saw it. In the corner of the page was the same symbol that was tattooed on David's back, the stylized spider in the center of a web, and next to the symbol, in small, block letters, was a description of its meaning. Maria read the words, and the world tilted on its axis. The air left her lungs, a cold, nauseating dread, far worse than anything she had felt before, washed over her. The tattoo was not a random piece of prison art. It was a symbol, a specific, horrific symbol used by a particular prison gang. It was a mark that identified the bearer as a man who had committed a certain kind of crime, a crime so heinous, so taboo, even in the brutal world of prison, that it earned the bearer a special, protected status. The tattoo meant that he had murdered a child, but it was the small, almost unnoticeable detail at the bottom of the description that made her heart stop. The tattoo was not just a symbol of the crime. It was a map. The intricate lines of the web were not random. They were a stylized representation of the location where the body was buried. And the spider, the small dark shape at the center of the web, was a mark of ownership, a brand. It was a tattoo that was given to members of the gang who had proven their loyalty in the most brutal way possible. And then she saw the final, horrifying detail. A small, almost invisible modification to the spider's body. A tiny, extra line. A mark that signified a specific, personal detail of the crime. The description next to it was clinical, brutal, and utterly soul-destroyingly clear. The extra line signified that the killer had not just murdered the child, he had taken a trophy, a piece of them, and he had incorporated it into his own body. Maria stared at the paper, her mind refusing to process the words. It was impossible. A mistake. David, her David, was not a child murderer. He was in prison for manslaughter, for a bar fight. But the tattoo was real. The description was real. And a new, terrible memory surfaced in her mind. A memory from their lovemaking, from that first night. In the heat of the moment, she had noticed something strange, something she had dismissed as a quirk of his body, a change wrought by age or the harsh prison life, a small, hard, unnatural feeling lump at the base of his penis. She had thought it was a cyst, a scar, a harmless anomaly. Now, with the horrifying description on the paper in front of her, she knew what it was. It was not a cyst, it was not a scar, it was the trophy, a small, hard object that had been surgically implanted under the skin, a piece of his victim, a permanent, hidden reminder of his true crime. The man she had married, the man she had waited for, the man she had just shared a bed with, was not just a killer. He was a monster of a kind she could not have imagined in her worst nightmares. The crime he had been imprisoned for was a lie, a cover for something infinitely more terrible. She looked at the man sleeping, in her bed, his face peaceful in his drunken slumber. He was not a victim of injustice. He was a predator who had hidden in plain sight, his gentle, quiet demeanor a perfect camouflage for the darkness within. Her entire life, her entire love story, was a lie, a carefully constructed fiction built around a monster. She backed out of the room, her hand over her mouth to stifle a scream. She grabbed her keys, her purse, and she ran. She ran from the house, from the man in her bed, from the life that had just been revealed as a grotesque horror story. She got in her car and drove, with no destination in mind, her only thought to get as far away as possible from the man with the terrible, unspeakable secret hidden in his own flesh. Maria drove through the pre-dawn darkness of Phoenix, the suburban streets a blur of surreal, silent normality. Her mind was a maelstrom of horror and disbelief. The flyer, the tattoo, the lump, the pieces of a puzzle she had never known existed were snapping together, forming a picture of such profound, monstrous evil that her brain struggled to accept it. The David she had loved, the gentle, kind man, the victim of injustice he had never existed. He was a character, a role played by a predator. The 10 years she had spent waiting, the decade of her life she had sacrificed in a state of suspended animation, had not been a testament to her love. It had been a fool's errand. She had been keeping a candle lit for a monster. She didn't know where to go. She couldn't go to a friend's house. How could she explain this? How could she put into words the grotesque discovery she had made? She drove aimlessly for an hour, her knuckles white on the steering wheel, the horrifying words from the flyer burning in her mind. *A. Trophy, incorporated into his own body. Finally, her training as a nurse, her instinct to seek out logic and procedure in the midst of chaos, took over. She needed to do something. She couldn't just run. She had to go to the police. She pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour diner, the fluorescent lights a harsh, unwelcome glare. She sat in her car for a long time, her body trembling. She took out her phone, her fingers clumsy and numb. She didn't call 911. This wasn't an emergency in that sense. This was a slow-motion detonation that had been happening for over a decade. She looked up the non-emergency number for the Phoenix Police Department. Her voice, when she spoke to the dispatcher, was a low, steady monotone, the voice of someone who has gone far beyond hysteria into a state of cold, clear shock. "I need to report a crime," she said. "A murder, an old one." 2 detectives met her at the diner. They were used to strange, late-night calls, but the story Maria began to unfold was unlike anything they had ever heard. She told them everything. The 10-year wait, the reunion, the flashes of anger, the tattoo, the drunken assault, and finally, the discovery of the flyer and the horrifying realization of what the small, hard lump on her husband's body truly was. She handed them the folded, worn flyer. The detectives, a man and a woman in their 40s, looked at it, their professional composure momentarily faltering. They had heard of prison gangs, of their brutal codes, and their symbolic tattoos. But this was something else. This was a level of depravity that was almost mythological. You're saying your husband, David Sanchez, who was just released from prison for manslaughter, is actually a child murderer? The male, Detective Morales, asked, his voice carefully neutral. Yes, Maria said, her voice not wavering. And I think the proof is on his body. The detectives knew they were in uncharted territory. They had a credible, though deeply disturbed, witness. They had a piece of deep, physical, albeit bizarre, evidence in the form of the flyer. And they had a suspect, a recently released felon, currently asleep in a house just a few miles away. They took Maria to the station, placing her in a quiet room with a victim's advocate. Then, they began to move. They knew they had to act quickly, before David woke up, before he realized she was gone, before he could run. A warrant was obtained based on Maria's testimony. It was a strange, unprecedented warrant, authorizing not just the search of the house, but the physical examination of David Sanchez's body, specifically his genital area, for evidence of a surgically implanted foreign object. The raid on the Sanchez home happened just as the sun was beginning to rise. A SWAT team, briefed on David's violent outburst and the potential for him to be a far more dangerous criminal than his record suggested, surrounded the small, quiet house. They broke down the door and found him just as Maria had left him, passed out in bed, lost in a drunken slumber. He was taken into custody without a struggle, his bleary, confused protests silenced by the overwhelming show of force. He was taken to a secure medical facility, where, under the authority of the warrant, he was examined by a police surgeon. The surgeon's report was concise, clinical, and utterly chilling. It confirmed Maria's discovery. A small, hard, bead-like object, approximately 5 millimeters in diameter, had been surgically implanted beneath the skin at the base of David's penis. It was a practice known in the darkest corners of prison and gang culture as pearling. But the object used was not a pearl or a plastic bead. The surgeon, unable to identify the object visually, took a small biopsy sample. While they waited for the lab results, the detectives began to dig into David's past and into the crime for which he had been imprisoned. The manslaughter conviction had been for the death of a man named Carlos Ramirez in a bar fight. The case had been straightforward, almost mundane. A fight, a punch, a fight, man falling and hitting his head. But now, the detectives looked at it with new eyes. Was it possible that the entire case had been a fabrication? They pulled the old case files. They re-interviewed the original witnesses. The key witness, the man who had pointed the finger at David, had died a few years ago. But they found another man who had been there that night, a man who had been too afraid to come forward at the time. He told them a different story. He said that David hadn't thrown the fatal punch. He said that the man who had was a known enforcer for a local chapter of a powerful prison gang, the same gang whose symbol was the spiderweb. He said that David had been there, but he had been a bystander, and that after the conviction, David had been claimed by the gang in prison, offered their protection in exchange for his loyalty. The picture was becoming clearer. David had not been a killer when he went into prison. He had been a patsy. He had taken the fall for a gang-related killing, and in return, he had been given the protection of that gang on the inside. But that protection had come at a terrible price. To become a full member, to earn his place, and his safety in that brutal world, he had to prove his loyalty. He had to commit a crime on their orders. The detectives began to search for unsolved child murders, for missing children cases that had occurred in or around the prison system during the time of David's incarceration. It was a grim, heartbreaking task. They were looking for a ghost, a victim whose case had gone cold. And then, the lab results from the biopsy came back. The small, hard object was not a bead. It was a piece of calcified organic material. It was, the report concluded, a piece of a human tooth. Specifically, a deciduous tooth. A baby tooth. The final, horrific piece of the puzzle snapped into place. The detectives now had a DNA profile, albeit a partial one, of a victim. They ran it through the national database of missing persons, and they got a hit. The tooth belonged to a 6-year-old boy named Samuel Flores. Samuel had been the son of a prison guard at the same facility where David was incarcerated. He had been abducted from his own backyard 8 years earlier. The case had been a massive, heartbreaking local story. A huge search had been launched, but no trace of the boy was ever found. He had simply vanished. The case had eventually gone cold, leaving a permanent, open wound in the community and destroying the boy's family. The detectives now knew what had happened. The gang, as an act of revenge or intimidation against the prison guard, had ordered a hit on his son. And David Sanchez, the quiet, gentle mechanic, the man who had gone to prison for a crime he didn't commit, had been the one chosen to carry it out. In order to prove his loyalty, to earn his spiderweb tattoo, to survive in the world he had been thrown into, he had abducted and murdered a 6-year-old boy. He had buried the body, following the map of the tattoo, and had kept a piece of his victim, a baby tooth, as a trophy, a permanent, hidden testament to his monstrous act. The man who had walked out of prison was not a man brutalized by a decade of incarceration. He was a man who had made a Faustian bargain, trading his soul for his survival. The flashes of rage, the paranoia, the contempt for his son's softness. It was not post-traumatic stress. It was the behavior of a predator, a man who had fully integrated the brutal, violent code of the gang into his very being. When the detectives confronted David with the evidence, the DNA match, the story of Samuel Flores, he did not confess. He did not break down. He simply went silent. The mask of the gentle, wronged man was gone, replaced by a cold, empty stillness. He looked at the detectives with the dead eyes of a man who had nothing left to lose, because he had already lost his own soul years ago in a prison cell. The news was delivered to Maria by Detective Morales and the victim's advocate. They sat with her in the quiet, sterile room at the station, and gently, carefully, laid out the truth. They told her about Samuel Flores. They told her what the tattoo really meant, and they told her what the lump on her husband's body truly was. Maria listened, her face a pale, blank mask. She did not cry. She did not scream. She had already passed through the stages of grief and terror. She was now in a place beyond that, a cold, empty void of pure, absolute horror. The man she had loved, the man she had waited for, the man whose child she had raised, was one of the worst kinds of monsters imaginable. Her entire life, her love story, was not just a lie. It was a grotesque obscenity. The legal process moved forward. The manslaughter conviction was overturned, not as an act of justice for David, but as a legal necessity to clear the way for the new, far more serious charges. He was charged with the kidnapping and murder of Samuel Flores. The case became a media sensation, a story of almost unbelievable depravity. The trophy killer, the headlines screamed. The story of the tattoo, of the implanted tooth, was a detail so gruesome, so bizarre, that it captured the public's darkest fascinations. Maria, in an act of profound self-preservation, divorced him. The process was quick, clinical. She did not see him. She did not speak to him. She simply signed the papers, severing the legal tie that had bound her to a monster. She was no longer Mrs. David Sanchez. She was Maria Flores, a name she reclaimed from her own family, a name that was untainted by his crimes. She and Leo moved. They left the small house in Phoenix, the house that was now a crime scene, a place of haunted memories. They moved to a different state, to a place where no one knew their story. Maria changed her name. She was trying to erase herself, to disappear from a story that had consumed her. The trial of David Sanchez was short. The evidence was overwhelming. The most powerful testimony came from Samuel Flores's parents. The prison guard and his wife, their faces aged with a decade of unresolved grief, took the stand and spoke of their beautiful, vibrant son, the boy who had been stolen from their backyard. They spoke of the years of not knowing, the years of hoping against hope, a torture that was, in its own way, as cruel as the murder itself. David sat at the defense table, silent and impassive. He did not testify. He showed no emotion. He was a black hole, a void of humanity. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. Maria did not attend the trial. She followed it through the news, a distant, horrified observer of the final chapter of the life she had once shared. When the verdict was announced, she felt not relief, not a sense of justice, but only a profound, soul-crushing emptiness. There was no victory here. There was only loss. She had to tell her son, Leo, the full truth. It was the hardest thing she had ever had to do. She sat down with the quiet, serious young man who was her son, and she told him who his father really was. She told him about Samuel Flores. She told him about the tattoo. She told him about the tooth. Leo listened, his face pale, his expression unreadable. When she was finished, he was silent for a long time. And then he said, his voice a low, steady whisper, "He's not my father. My father died in a bar fight 10 years ago. I don't know who that man is." It was an act of profound, psychological self-preservation. He had to kill the memory of his father in order to survive the truth of him. The man he had been raised to admire, the victim of injustice, was a fiction. And Leo, like his mother, had to accept that the life he had believed in was a lie. The story of Maria and David Sanchez is a story about the nature of evil. It is not always a loud, obvious thing. Sometimes it is quiet, patient, hidden behind a gentle smile and a victim's narrative. David Sanchez was not born a monster. He was forged into one in the brutal, dehumanizing crucible of the prison system. He made a choice, a terrible, unforgivable choice, to sacrifice another's life, a child's life, for his own survival, and in doing so, he became something less than human. Maria's love, her loyalty, her decade of patient waiting, had been for a ghost. The man she loved had died long before she ever knew it. The tragedy is not just that she was married to a monster. The tragedy is that she had spent a decade of her life loving a memory, only to discover that the memory itself was a complete lie. Her reunion, the moment that was supposed to be the beginning of her new life, was simply the moment she finally learned the truth about the end of her old one. The 4 days between his release and her discovery were not a failed reunion. They were a horrifying, condensed epilogue to a story that had ended for her, without her knowledge, 10 years earlier. The years following David Sanchez's conviction and death sentence were, for Maria, a long, slow and painful process of rebuilding a life from the rubble of a devastating truth. She and Leo settled in a small, anonymous town in Pest, the Pacific Northwest, a place of misty rain and towering green trees, a world away from the harsh, sun-bleached landscape of her past. She took a job at a local clinic under her new name, her days filled with the quiet, methodical work of caring for others, a routine that was a balm to her fractured soul. She lived in a state of self-imposed exile, not just from her old life, but from her own history. She never spoke of David, she never spoke of Phoenix, she never spoke of the trial. The story was a toxic, radioactive thing, a secret she kept locked away in the deepest, most guarded part of her mind. To the new people in her life, she was a quiet, kind, and intensely private widow, a woman with a sad, unspoken story in her past. They respected her privacy, sensing a grief too profound to be questioned. Leo, in his own quiet way, was also rebuilding. He finished high school and, to Maria's surprise, decided to study forensic science in college. It was a choice that worried her, a sign that he was not, as she had hoped, simply forgetting the past. He was, in his own analytical, scientific way, trying to understand it. He was drawn to the logic, the order, the irrefutable truth of evidence. In a world that had been revealed to be a chaotic mess of lies and deception, science was an anchor. Their relationship was close, but it was marked by a vast, silent space. They never spoke of David. He was a black hole in the center of their family, his gravity so immense that even his name was a forbidden word. They orbited around this central, unspoken trauma, their lives shaped by its invisible pull. Maria tried to date. Her friends at the clinic would try to set her up with kind, eligible men. She would go on a few awkward dates, but she could never let anyone get close. The betrayal she had experienced was so absolute that it had destroyed her ability to trust. She would look at a man's kind smile, at his gentle eyes, and she would see a mask. She would wonder what secrets, what darkness lay hidden beneath the surface. The ghost of David Sanchez, the monster who had worn the face of a gentle man, sat at the table with her on every date. After a while, she stopped trying. She accepted that a part of her was broken, a part that could never be fixed. She resigned herself to a life of quiet solitude, finding companionship in books, in her garden, and in her deep, quiet love for her son. David Sanchez sat on death row for 15 years. He was a ghost in the system, a man who had already died in every way that mattered. He never spoke of his crime. He never expressed remorse. He met with his lawyers, filed his appeals, and existed in the sterile, monotonous routine of life on the row. He was a problem for the prison system. The notoriety of his crime, the gruesome detail of the implanted tooth, made him a target. He was kept in solitary confinement for his own protection, a man too monstrous even for day. The world of monsters. During those years, a young, ambitious journalist named Rachel Harding became obsessed with his case. She saw it not just as a sensational true crime story, but as a profound and disturbing story about the nature of evil and the failures of the justice system. She spent years researching the case, interviewing the detectives, the lawyers, the family of Samuel Flores. She wanted to understand how a man like David Sanchez could come to be. She wrote to him in prison, requesting an interview. For years, he refused. But as his final appeal was denied, and his execution date was set, something in him shifted. Perhaps it was the looming finality of his own death, a desire to have his story told. Or perhaps it was just a final, narcissistic act of a man who had always been the secret protagonist of his own dark narrative. He agreed to talk to her. The interviews took place in a small, sterile room on death row, the two of them separated by a thick pane of plexiglass. The man Rachel saw was not the monster she had expected. He was a quiet, greying man in his late 50s, his face a blank, emotionless mask. He spoke in a low, flat monotone, recounting the events of his life with a chilling, detached clarity. He told her about his childhood, about the bar fight, about taking the fall for the gang. He spoke of his first few years in prison, of the constant terror, the violence, the feeling of being a prey animal in a world of predators. "You do what you have to do to survive," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "They offered me a deal. I took it. It was a choice between my life and someone else's. I chose mine." He described the murder of Samuel Flores with the same cold detachment. He spoke of it as a job, an assignment he had to complete to earn his place. He showed no remorse, no guilt, only a kind of grim, pragmatic acceptance. He had done what was necessary. "And the trophy?" Rachel asked, her own voice trembling slightly. "Why did you do that?" For the first time, a flicker of something that might have been emotion crossed his face. A faint, almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw. "That was part of the deal," he said. "It's their rule. A way to make sure you can never go back. A way to make sure you are one of them, forever. It's a brand. It marks you. You carry it. With you, always. A reminder of who you are." In his twisted, brutal world, the horrific act of implanting the tooth was not a trophy of his kill. It was a brand of his own damnation, a permanent, physical manifestation of the soul he had sold for his own survival. Rachel's book, The Spider's Web, The Secret Life of David Sanchez, was a bestseller. It was a harrowing, deeply disturbing portrait of a man who was both a victim and a monster, a man whose life was a testament to the brutalizing, soul-destroying nature of the prison system. The book did not excuse his crime, but it contextualized it, placing it within a larger, more terrifying system of violence and survival. Maria read the book. Leo, now a forensic scientist himself, had given it to her. "I think you should read this, Mom," he had said. "I think we need to understand." She read it in a single, painful sitting. She read about the man she had loved, the boy who had been thrown to the wolves. She read about the terrible choice he had made. And for the first time, she felt not just horror, not just betrayal, but a sliver of a profound, tragic pity. The man she had waited for had been killed in that prison, not by a shiv or a beating, but by a slow, systematic process of moral evisceration. The monster who had come out was all that was left. The book had a profound effect on her. It did not lessen the horror of what he had done, but it allowed her to separate the man she had loved from the monster he had become. It allowed her to finally, truly, grieve for the David she had lost, the boy who had died in that prison cell so many years ago. A week before his scheduled execution, David Sanchez received one final letter. It was from Maria. She had not written to him in 15 years. The letter was short. David, it began. I have spent the last 15 years hating you. I have hated you for the lies, for the betrayal, and for the unspeakable thing you did. I have hated you for destroying my life, for destroying our son's image of his father, and for making our love story into a horror story. But I recently read a book about you, and for the first time, I began to understand. I do not forgive you. What you did is unforgivable, but I am writing to tell you that I am letting go of the hate. It is a poison, and I will not let it consume the rest of my life. I will remember the boy I fell in love with, the kind, gentle boy who loved stray cats and cried at sad movies. I will choose to believe that that boy was real, and I will grieve for him, and for the man he never got to become. I hope, in these final days, that you are able to find some measure of peace. I have found mine. Maria. David Sanchez was executed by lethal injection on a quiet Tuesday morning. His last words were, "I'm sorry." It was not clear to whom he was apologizing. To the family of Samuel Flores, to Maria, or perhaps, finally, to himself, to the boy he had been, the boy he had sacrificed on the altar of his own survival. The news of his execution was a small, quiet event in Maria's life. She felt no joy, no sense of closure, only a profound, weary sadness. A chapter had closed, a long, dark and terrible chapter. A few years later, Leo got married. He married a kind, intelligent woman, a fellow scientist. At the wedding, he stood up to give a toast. He spoke of his mother, of her strength, her resilience, her unwavering love. "My mother taught me what it means to love unconditionally," he said, his eyes finding hers across the room. "She taught me what it means to hold on to hope, even in the darkest of times, and she taught me what it means to survive and to rebuild. She is the strongest person I have ever known." Tears streamed down Maria's face. They were not the tears of grief or horror she had shed for so many years. They were tears of a quiet, hard-won joy. She looked at her son, at his beautiful new wife, at the life he was building, a life of love and truth and science, and she knew that the cycle had been broken. The darkness had not won. The story of Maria Sanchez is not a story about a monster. It is a story about a survivor. It is a story about a woman who looked into the face of an unimaginable evil and refused to be consumed by it. She had lost her husband, her marriage, her name, and a decade of her life to a lie. But she had not lost herself. She had rebuilt a life from the tamed ashes, a quiet, simple life, but a life that was her own, a life built on the unshakable foundation of a mother's love. The 4 days of her reunion with David were not the end of her story. They were the fiery crucible in which she was forged into the woman she was always meant to be, resilient, strong, and, in the end, free.